So on his dictate in 1888, stole a whole shit ton of gold and silver away from the Kentucky legislature. He was a treasurer. Then they wanted to audit the treasurer, and they wanted to audit the auditor's office too. So a defect that could be cured only by a constitutional requirement for a secretly cast written ballot. If voting was done alone in secret, it would be theoretically impossible for vote buyers to know for certain that the seller had fulfilled the sales agreement. The third Constitution, as well as the previous charters, placed no limits on the number of counties in Kentucky, which by 1890 had 119 of these local governmental units. A majority of counties could not support themselves and required state funds to function. Observers contended the number and small size of counties contributed to the outbreak of feuds in eastern Kentucky after the Civil War. Labor leaders demanded constitutional reform to prohibit the employment of children in dangerous occupations such as mining, and to prohibit mining companies from paying their employees in company scrip that was legal tender only in company stores that charged exorbitant, really high prices. Reformers also demanded the constitutional prohibition of lotteries, which were said to extract money primarily from poor wage earners and to exaggerate their promises of payoffs. Despite these constitutional deficiencies, voters in 5 referenda between 1875 and 1885 rejected convention calls. So 5 times in a row for the 10 years, 1875 to 1885, shall Kentucky have a constitutional convention? No. Shall Kentucky have a constitutional? No. Shall Kentucky? No, 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 no. Like, they rejected convention calls in large part because of the controversial method that the legislature had devised to ascertain the number of voters that were needed to approve such a call. Reform of that method in 1887 facilitated voter approval of a convention call in the referendum of that year, and another in 1889. The Constitutional Convention convened in September 1890. The fourth and current Kentucky Constitution. A major objective of the convention, which did not adjourn until April 1891, concerned the drafting of provisions that limited the legislature. The Constitution prohibited most private, local, and special legislation, limited legislative sessions to once every 2 years and to only 60 days, required bills to be read at least once in their entirety to the full House and Senate, and specified that no law could be amended by reference to its title only. Rather, a bill needed to be published in its entirety so legislators would know what and how they were amended. For the first time in the state's constitutional history, the governor could exercise a line-item veto on appropriation measures, and population, not the number of voters, determined legislative representation. So, wow, there's a lot of interesting things that's going on here. Line-item veto on appropriation measures. So that means they could issue the budget, but the governor could say no to this, to this, to that, and to this. And then they're also talking about the publishing the bills, and that the bills had to be read in their entirety. That's amazing. I mean, if the bill has to be read in its entirety, then everybody would know that every little provision or something else, it was read in the public record. So if it had to be read in its entirety in order to be passed, then it would at least be said out loud sometime at some point. And so I think those are some really tremendous. I think there should be some sort of go back to basics. Yeah, we can have all these great electronic voting machines, but we can also just take the fucking voting ticket and just put the ticket down into a cardboard box that we cut out a little hole in the top. And so we can go back to voting just like that, or voice voting, or raising hands, and the like. And so, whereas secret ballot has its, benefits, also going back to the basics of just saying, here's us, we all have one vote, what can we do? So, for the first time in the state's constitutional history, the governor could exercise a line-item veto on appropriation measures, and population, not the number of voters, determined legislative representation. The Constitution also provided for the secret printed Australian ballot, abolished tax immunities for corporations. So I guess the secret printed Australian ballot is how we voted, we the people, abolished tax immunities for corporations, which is amazing, right? No more tax immunities for corporations. That was the 1891 Constitution. Strictly regulated railroads, limited local taxation and indebtedness, established more circuit/trial courts, and eliminated legislatively created courts, including the Superior Court, which had been established by the legislature in 1880 as an intermediate appellate appellate court designed to relieve a temporary burden on the Court of Appeals. The Constitution eliminated a provision found in the previous two constitutions that prohibited clergymen from serving as governor or as a member of the General Assembly. So provision found in the previous two constitutions. So that means 1799 and 1750 said that clergymen were not allowed to serve as governor or a member of the General Assembly. So that's, you know, either Father David Rice, that was the reactionaries against Father David Rice, or something else is going on. Maybe John G. Fee, John Greg Fee, who founded Berea. He was a Christian minister too, and the Presbyterian minister David Rice, who tried to stop slavery in 1792 before it got out of control. So the Constitution eliminated a provision found in the previous two constitutions that prohibited clergymen from serving as governor as a member of the General Assembly. This 1891 Constitution. The Constitution made it nearly impossible to create new counties and limited the fees and salaries of local officials. The existing fee system having unduly enriched some of the officers of Louisville and other cities and having led to abuses by certain county officials. The new Constitution also limited the salaries of most public officials to $5,000 annually, made all elected state executive officers ineligible for successive terms, provided for stricter audits of the Treasurer's office, mandated legislative prohibitions of child labor and company script, abolished lotteries, protected suits for personal injury and wrongful death, forbade slavery, which had already been prohibited by the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, provided for racially segregated public schools, and rendered another constitutional convention less likely, but made constitutional change easier by providing for the first time that individual amendments could be proposed by the legislature, 2 per legislative session, and adopted by popular vote. So, okay, provided for racially segregated public schools, right? So there's segregation in 1891. Rendered another constitutional convention less likely, but made constitutional change easier, but provided for the first time individual amendments could be proposed by legislature, 2 per legislative session, and adopted by popular vote. So we could amend the Constitution, but another Constitution convention was less likely, so it made it even harder for a constitutional convention to happen. In racially segregated public schools, so there would be 2 public school systems, and so that black schools might have forced white schools to be created. Some proposed constitutional reforms failed to be adopted, especially on women's rights, arguing that such a proposal would threaten the sanctity of the home and marriage. The all-male delegates voted down a provision that would have given married women some control over their property. For much the same reason, they also rejected provisions that would have empowered the legislature to grant women the right to vote, whether generally or only for school officers and on school matters, and to be eligible for any school office. However, the Constitution did implicitly authorize the legislature to continue to allow women to vote for school trustees. Critics of the newly drafted Constitution argued that it resembled a code of laws instead of a basic frame of government, a charge echoed by some modern scholars. Supporters of the document rightly countered that a more detailed and lengthy Constitution was necessary given the unwillingness of the legislature to reform itself and government in general to effectively regulate abuse of corporations. They also pointed out that the newly minted constitutions of other states were likewise lengthy and detailed for the same reason. After voters overwhelmingly ratified the new charter, the convention reassembled, supposedly only to make minor clarifying revisions of the new Constitution. However, minor revision sometimes turned into substantive changes, such as making the Railroad Commission elective instead of appointive. Soon after the convention adjourned, the Sine Die and issued a final version of the Constitution. Opponents sued to invalidate the charter because of the substantial revisions made after popular ratification. The Court of Appeals rejected this challenge, holding in 1892 that the Constitution was valid despite the post-ratification alterations. So the Railroad Commission became elective instead of appointive. So you see how the Railroad Commission automatically gets a fucking, a whop, an axe. I think in 2000 the voters totally wiped it out. But the Railroad Commission was supposed to be appointed, and then it changed to being elective. And so instead of the governor saying this is going to be the person, I don't know, the Railroad Commission could have more influence over an elected position than an appointed position. But it could have been the other way. That could have been strengthened too. So eventually it gets totally knocked out. Constitutional revision. This is actually the fucking paragraph that I wanted the world to know about. Okay, so Constitutional reformers have used amendment rather than a convention to change the Constitution. Voters rejected convention calls in legislative-directed referenda conducted in 1931, 1947, 1960, and 1977. In an attempt to draft and adopt a new Constitution, the legislature in 1964 invoked Section 4 of the Constitution, which gives the people the right to alter, reform, or abolish their government in such a manner as they may deem proper, and established a constitutional revision assembly composed of 50 legislative selective delegates, one from each of the state's 38 senatorial districts, 7 former governors, and 5 at-large members, including the mayor of Louisville and the county judge of Jefferson County. In early 1966, the Assembly proposed a constitution of 13,500 words, 8,000 fewer than the existing charter. The document provided for sweeping reforms that included a unified judiciary, some popularly elected state officers such as the governor and lieutenant governor who could serve 2 consecutive terms, other state officers such as the superintendent of public education and secretaries of state and treasury who would be appointed, the elimination of most county officers as constitutional positions, and elections to be held in even-numbered years only. It raised the state debt limit, facilitated constitutional amendments, abolished the Railroad Commission. Again, right, they just can't wait to get rid of the Railroad Commission. And state governmental salary limits, and made wiretaps unconstitutional, which have been relevant now, you know, with the NSA having wiretaps being unconstitutional. The proposed new Constitution, this is 1966, secured legislative approval, withstood a legal challenge to its constitutionality, received support from many newspaper scholars and political leaders. However, other politicians, including gubernatorial candidates from both parties and many county officials who feared a loss of power, even loss of office, opposed the document, which the voters overwhelmingly rejected by a vote of 514,034 to 143,133. So that was a complete fucking loss. 1966 wasn't even close. So let's take a look at some of the issues again. So the reforms, they wanted a united judiciary. Well, who can get excited about that? Some popularly elected state officers, such as governor and lieutenant governor, who could serve 2 consecutive terms. It's hard to argue with that. Other state officers, such as the superintendent of public education and secretaries of state and treasury would be appointed. The elimination of most county officers as constitutional positions. That's what fucked them. That's what fucked them over. In 1966, they would have been able to get this thing passed. It's probably a good fucking document because they had a lot of people that were supporting it, but the local people didn't want to support it because it eliminated the most of the county officers as constitutional positions. So there wasn't constitutionally obligated to elect some jailer, even if the jailer doesn't do shit. You know, the jailer just basically takes somebody who arrests somebody else and then transport them, and that's all the jailer does. That's like irrelevant and redundant and pointless. But if you're the jailer, you don't want to lose that job. So that's how the 1966 constitutional reform, which was a good attempt. It was a good attempt by going by statute. So they were going by statute. So they had put the thing on the ballot for the people to vote upon instead of calling the convention, and that's where they got most of the changes. And unfortunately, the changes would have fucked over a lot of the local people, and so the local people made sure their people, you know. So basically, have all the same changes instead of cutting the jobs. Just make sure you retain all the local county positions. In fact, the local county positions, that's where you want home rule, and you want the power to go back to the local folks. So I'm not for sure why, you know, Frankfurt always wants more power, but they have all the power since they dictate the entire, you know, structure of every county in the whole state. So proposed legislative amendments to the Constitution have met with more success and have accomplished many of the revisions proposed by the rejected Assembly Constitution of 1966. So the rejected Assembly Constitution of 1966 was a major defeat for reformists who wanted to have an operable constitution, since one doesn't exist. Since 1891, the legislature has approved and submitted to the voters 79 proposed amendments for the ratification, of which 44 have been approved and 33 rejected. So 44 out of 79 have been rejected. So let's see, the Court of Appeals kept 2 amendments off the ballot because their provisions had not been publicized in the manner specified by the Constitution, and invalidated 3 of the 44 amendments that had been ratified. 2 because they were not validly publicized, and one, because the subject of the amendment was properly addressed by statute than by constitutional amendment. So they says that you should have just passed a statute instead of passing a constitutional amendment for this thing. So just pass a fucking law. Don't burden the fucking poor voters with another poor choice. They can barely fucking pull up their pants, let alone turn a knob, sideways to vote. 75% of Kentuckians do not vote.